Salvatore, we are going to have an exclusive session with you just to get your perspective. We have had a session just now that discussed about we had Jane Elliott, a diversity educator, who talked about how to bridge the gaps, create an understanding among the children, how not to seed race consciousness. And similarly, we've had diluted caste consciousness among our citizenry in India or here. As we come here, we in fact have children who do not really know about caste, except when they're taught it in their history textbooks, as you mentioned in your quote. Today, on the other hand, we have certain PTO meetings that are race conscious meetings, where a teacher, if an African-American teacher will interact with an African-American child, and a Hispanic with Hispanic, and a white teacher with white. That sort of thing is creating further divides among our society instead of what diversity education used to mean in the United States. And similarly, embedment of caste in the United States will create similar oppressor-oppressed sort of dynamics within our community, which is actually a micro minority here. So Salvatore, I wanted to get your perspective, given that you are an educator and academic of such high standing and repute. We wanted to get your understanding of how you see the dynamics of current political legislation that is coming up in the United States.
Oh, look, thank you very much. And I have been here in the audience for the previous session. I enjoyed it very much. And thank you. I learned from all of you. But I do have some prepared remarks. You asked me to prepare about 5 minutes of remarks. They more or less answer the question you just posed. I think everyone has to be aware that caste has come to America. Caste resolutions, caste ordinances, collective bargaining in the Harvard collective bargaining agreement with graduate students, even laws, the California law, as you all know, is now up for consideration, is passed out of committee on caste. So all of these issues are being raised in the United States. Now, let's be frank. It seems very clear that most of this is driven by manufactured outrage, which is to say there has not been an upwelling of legitimate complaints and concerns about caste discrimination in the United States, whether at universities or out in the private sector. This simply hasn't happened. There have been a small number of isolated cases, and even those small number of isolated cases, there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that they are astroturfed cases, or that they don't genuinely represent the actual experiences of the people who are bringing the cases. I can't say that definitively. I'm just saying that this is my impression from reviewing the cases. Instead, it seems like the caste in America narrative is being driven by manufactured outrage. It is being manufactured, again, I'm just going to be very frank with you, by international Islamists. I always emphasize, not Indian Muslims. International Islamists in the United States, in the Middle East, and the UK, and by anti-Hindu people, that is by anti-Hindu prejudice, people who have an anti-Hindu or simply anti-Indian agenda, who view caste as the wedge issue on which they can criticize India and criticize Hindus. Now, the problem is that in the American context, you can't fight this issue. You can't fight the caste discrimination issue by simply denying that caste discrimination exists. You also can't fight it in the court of public opinion by saying that caste is a Hindu issue, and thus it breaks the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution to have a focus on caste. That might work in a court. I'm not a lawyer. It is not going to work in the court of public opinion. Americans are always ready to fight injustices, and if you're going to win this challenge, you beat this challenge, you have to educate non-Indian Americans about caste. So the first thing to educate them on is, when we're talking caste in America, we're talking jati. I would even encourage you to try to shift the term from caste to jati. The Varna system is very inspiring to many people. We heard several talks about Varna just now, but Varna is not the target of this legislation. The target of this legislation is endogamous caste groups reflected in last names, reflected in people's community identity. This is about jati. And so the first suggestion is you should shift the debate to jati. Much more importantly, you should emphasize that caste discrimination is a historical Indian problem. It is not a Hindu problem, which is to say, caste is something that comes out of India. It is not something that comes out of Hinduism. And so when you talk about Varna, yes, you can make strong connections between Hindu scriptures and the Varna system. But the Varna system is not caste as defined in India by the Constitution, as we mean in the cases that have arisen in the US. What we're talking about when we talk caste is jati. And that's why I encourage you to strongly distinguish between Varna as a Hindu system and caste as an Indian system. And I emphasize that because surveys show, the Pew Research Center's survey of religion in India shows that most Muslims in India have a caste, that is, they identify with a caste. Nearly all Sikhs identify with a caste. A large number of Christians, about 1/3 of Indian Christians, identify a caste identity when asked on surveys. Now, that's despite the fact that in India, jati or caste is not recognized for Muslim Sikhs and Christians, because in principle, well, they're outside the system. And if you want to be a scheduled caste, there are 1,108 scheduled castes, 744 scheduled tribes, 2,479 other backwards castes. There are more than 1,000, although they're not enumerated, quote unquote, forward castes. None of this, all of this applies to Muslims just as much as it applies to Hindus. In India, they're not listed because a Muslim can't get a reservation for caste. But that's a distinct attribute of Indian law. That's not the social reality of caste. The social reality is that Muslims have a jati. There are Rajput Muslims. There are, I'm not going to go through the list. I'll get one wrong. There are Muslims in many, many jati in India. Again, Sikhs have identify with a jati, and most Christians, or at least a plurality of Christians, identify with a jati. Okay. By contrast, even though it's often said, and it's often remarked that Islam, Sikhism, Christianity don't recognize caste hierarchy, the same is true of modern Hinduism. Every major Hindu religious tradition today, every major one, every one that I've ever heard of, which is why I say major one, denies the relevance of caste hierarchy. They all have intercaste dining. They all have intercaste worship. And this goes back, this is not today, this goes back 200 years. I mean, Bhagwan Swami Narayan and Ram Mohan Roy were integrating, were fighting against caste hierarchy 2 centuries ago. V.D. Savarkar in the Hindutva movement, for all the Hindutva movement has been criticized for being casteist. They were trying to eliminate caste hierarchy. They were promoting intercaste dining 100 years ago. Simply put, there is no connection in modern Hinduism between jati and religion. Caste is an Indian social construct. And because 80% of Indians are Hindu, it's closely identified with Hinduism. But in the same way that Indian Islam has fought to eliminate caste within Islam, Hinduism has fought to eliminate caste within Hinduism. And in the same way that Indian Islam has only been partially successful, I mean, lower prestige jatis within Islam in India are dramatically underrepresented among Islamic leadership in India. In the same way, there still remain jati hierarchies in India among Hindus. But the hierarchy is a national social hierarchy, not a Hindu hierarchy. So to fight this pressure, this manufactured outrage around caste in the US, I strongly encourage you, first, own it, take it head on. Encourage a caste survey. Say that, well, Silicon Valley has problems with caste. If California has problems with caste, let's do a survey. Ask everyone of Indian origin to identify their caste and to talk about discrimination. Not Hindus, Indian Americans. Insist that caste or jati be treated as an Indian issue, not as a Hindu issue. Remember that you're fighting the weaponization of caste in America. You're not there fighting caste reservations or other political battles in India. Yes, in India, This may have been legally in the Constitution construed as a Hindu issue, but that's not the social reality. We have very high quality social survey data to show that this is not the social reality in India. And it's certainly neither the social nor the legal reality in the United States. I strongly encourage you to prevent this becoming the legal reality in the United States, and instead to focus on, yes, every Indian American wants to prevent caste discrimination in America, and you want to prevent it among all Indian Americans, not specifically among Hindus.
Thank you so much. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I think you brought out beautifully the difference between jati and varna. And it is so true that there is a lot of conflation. When we talk about caste, there is a vagueness to this term. Nobody really knows what caste really is. Is it jati? Is it just the colonial concept of caste, the hierarchies that were infiltrated into India due to the caste census that was imposed by the British? And on the other hand, varna, where Brahmin is a great big identity that is being targeted, the Brahmin is a varna, right? And it is not, as Salvatore just mentioned, it is not really related to the jati system. And yet, the Dalit term, which arises out of jatis, out of the, it is, again, another vague colonial term that was invented during the colonial times in India by the British. And, with the caste, Dalit, and Adivasi, with these three, there were a lot of divisions were created in India during the extraction economy of the British. The main thing that they did was the people whose wealth they extracted, the traders, the exporters, the merchants, those people actually became the Dalits of India, and they became the depressed classes, and they are the ones who actually obtain the reservation quotas in India. But as you said, those terms cannot be imported here, in the United States, Salvatore. I think I will encourage people here to ask any questions, if there are any, for Salvatore, because he has another 5 or 10 minutes. And I think this is a great opportunity to engage with him. And as he mentioned, there have been surveys which have shown that caste is a diluted identity in the United States. In fact, it is a diluted identity in India as well. People do not really practice it. The more educated people get, and as we know, there is a significant dilution in urban centers in India as well.
Before we go to questions, let me just quickly emphasize, caste is jati. In the Indian Constitution, in the list of scheduled castes and list of scheduled tribes, there are no Dalits, there are no Harijan, there are no untouchables. There is a list of jati that are protected under Indian law. And that should become the basis for talking about caste in the United States. And you should keep Varna. I'm sorry to tell people what to do. I'm not myself Hindu, but Varna is a sacred Hindu concept. Now, yes, British colonialists attempted to classify jati by Varna. Of course, members of jati fought endlessly over who was which Varna. There's no consensus except in a few cases around what Varna a jati is. Jati have been mobile in their Varna historically. We have a lot of evidence of this. There is no one-to-one map, or there's no direct mapping from jati into Varna. And because Varna is a Hindu issue, I strongly recommend that Hindu Americans insist that Varna is not caste. Varna is a Hindu spiritual concept. Caste is caste. Go back to the Indian Constitution, go back to the list of scheduled castes and otherwise other backward castes in India, and focus on that. When you do a survey of caste identity, don't allow the survey to be, are you Brahmin, Dalit, or other? Insist that the survey offer 1,108 scheduled castes that people can identify as. Insist the survey have 2479 OBCs that people can identify as. This is the way to address this attack in the US. If you simply say, we're not castists and you can't criticize caste because it's Hindu, you'll lose on both counts. You'll lose because first, all Americans want to fight discrimination when they hear about it. And you lose second, because everyone will now believe that caste is a Hindu concept. And both things are things you need to fight.
Very good point. I guess, yes, I think there are questions. Salvatore, I have one question for you. The main target of a lot of the discussion in the United States has been the term Brahmin, which, as you know, is part of the Varna system.
Yes.
And Varna, as you know, is an evolutionary concept in India where, there's always been the idea that humans can transcend their humanness and become more divine. And that is the whole concept that the Varna system encourages each person to do with the job that they do, whatever the job may be. It could be fighting, it could be just prayer, it could be education, it could be even crafting a pot as a potter. Everything in the end, the sculpture, they all lead to the divine, and the process is supposed to be dharmic, and that is why a potter will worship the mud that he uses, the sculptor will worship the wood that he's carving. So that whole idea has been ingrained in us, which is a wholly different and sort of foreign concept to the Western world, which is now at this time, as we come and join the Western civilization and be part of it, integrate really well, actually, as civilizational, human beings. But then when we are put into this little box of caste, and Brahmin is being targeted, which as you really mentioned, is not even part of caste. How do we even explain this? How do we even tackle it?
Look, you have to insist that Brahmin is not a caste. It simply isn't. There are Iers, there are Ozas, there are, forgive me, Satish, there are Sharmas. They may traditionally have occupied Brahmin roles in Indian society. But I wouldn't even get into the discussion that there are born Brahmins and made Brahmins. None of that matters, because that's a matter internal to the Hindu faith. So when the caste survey comes out, anyone who says, "Are you a Brahmin?" that should not be an allowable question, right? That would be the equivalent of asking, "Are you a Dalit?" And it's the same issue. Nobody is born a Brahmin or a Dalit in the United States in a caste survey. You should always be focusing caste as jati. The Indian Constitution does not recognize Brahmins as a caste. The Indian Constitution does not recognize Dalits as a caste. Well, come back to that continually. You have to seize the rhetorical basis of this debate if you want to win the debate. If you allow this to be Brahmins versus Dalits, I'm sorry, you're going to lose.
Thank you, Salvatore. I think there's one question from Japraji, please.
Thank you. A quick question, Salvatore. You mentioned it's an Indian issue and not a Hindu issue. My question is, when we go talk to these legislators who are really influenced by some of these evil forces, unfortunately, they say, okay, we won't put Hindu word in there, we won't put Indian word there, we'll put South Asians or Indo-Pacific region and things like that. So they try to go around it. And as you said, unfortunately, the majority of the people who come from India are Hindus, or from South Asia are Hindus. I mean, the other countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, very small countries, and India being the largest, and we still become the majority. Yep. And ultimately, we are the one who really getting the brunt of the whole issue. And then we are the one who are targeting. And you also mentioned that the Muslims and Sikhs and some of the other groups are all as bad as far as this classification goes. But at the same time, they already, putting themselves as victims. And unfortunately, as the Hindus, we are called bigots, fascists, and all kind of things just because they've done very, very well. So how do you eliminate that when it's going to go to the legislature or go to the the legal issues? These victims are always excused. It's always going to be the people who are the bigots or the fascists, the so-called, and these are all fabricated, fake narratives. So how do we counter those things? Thank you.
I encourage you to embrace it and run with it and make it work on your own terms. Look, the defense, "I'm not a Nazi," will never work in America. You can never say, "I'm not a white supremacist." What you have to say is, "I'm an anti-racist just like you." Okay, "I'm anti-caste." So when we do the caste survey, insist there has to be a caste survey. When you do the caste survey, yes, it should be South Asian, not just Indian. But in the caste survey, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, everybody from India or South Asia, whichever way you define it, should be included in the caste survey. And you have to just relentlessly push legislators. Yes, we acknowledge caste has long been an issue. Our temple, our denomination has been fighting for 200 years against caste. And then say, oh, and my Muslim brothers are also fighting against caste. We need to get them in the survey because Muslims face caste discrimination in India. Christians face caste discrimination in India. And the survey has to be a survey of Indians, not a survey of Hindus. Once you accept that this is a Hindu problem, you've lost. And that's clearly the strategy on the other side, is to identify caste as a Hindu problem. Let's be frank, this is the funding for all of this is coming from Islamist sources, whether that's state sponsors like Pakistan or rich individuals in the Persian Gulf. It's state-sponsored anti-Hindu propaganda. But you have to fight it in an American terms. If you don't fight it on American terms, you're going to lose. And I'm sorry, it's unfair that you have to fight this fight, but you should own it. You should say, yes, my temple has been fighting caste discrimination for a century. I want to be part of that fight. And here's what caste means. It means jati. The Indian Constitution defines it. We want to do a caste survey. The Pew Research Center has done a major survey of religion in India. They report, again, you can get the data from Pew on the number of Muslims who identify with various castes. You can identify people who identify as lower caste Muslims face discrimination within Islam in India. You can get some stats from discrimination in India, the upper caste Muslims in India dominating Islamic institutions in India. This has to become, you have to fight fire with fire on this. But most of all, you have to accept the debate. If you just say it's unfair of you to have this debate, in the court of public opinion, you're going to lose.
Salvatore, that was wonderful. I think you gave us many insights, and I know that you have another appointment. So thank you so much for making it happen. I know you had to juggle a lot to make this happen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks everyone for listening. I really appreciate it.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.